DOE CSGF Fellow Thomas Ludwig in the field of chemical engineering at Stanford University.
All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my talk. My name is Tom Ludwig, and I'm a PhD candidate at Stanford, and I'll be talking about chemical reactions at interfaces and applying enhanced sampling and global optimization methods to study those reactions. So first of all, why do we care about surface reactions? Well, one reason is that there's a sustainability challenge, which is that our fuels, chemicals, and energy, basically everything we depend on for a high quality of life in our modern economy, depend on fossil resources, as we're all aware. So an alternative to this is to convert readily available starting molecules like water, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen into valuable products. And these kinds of reactions are possible, but they're usually not efficient enough to be economically competitive with fossil resources. And that's where catalysis comes in. The more efficient the catalyst is, the more economically viable these kinds of reactions become. But in general, it's very difficult to improve these catalysts by trial and error methods. It can take thousands of experiments and many years and lots of money. So theoretical insight can be useful in terms of speeding up this process by developing an underlying theory and an understanding of how these things work. And here we show an example. It took many thousands of experiments to develop this iron catalyst, which is used industrially to make ammonia, which goes into fertilizer to make food. And in 2001, a catalyst was basically discovered by theory, which was cobalt and molybdenum. And experiments showed that, in fact, this catalyst does perform pretty well. So this is an encouraging path forward. We do have many challenges in this area, though. Models of chemical reactions are becoming increasingly more complex. And a lot of this is due to recent interest in electrochemistry. And in electrochemistry, you have an electrolyte interface. So an interface between an electrode and a catalyst and the electrolyte. And the question becomes, how do we optimize that total system, not just the catalyst itself? And we see that experimentally, these kinds of ion effects and solvent effects can be very important in determining the activity of these systems. And sort of to visualize this complexity, on the left here, you see what it would be like to model a gas interface with a metal. And this is a relatively simple structure that can basically be found by a local optimization. But when we add solvent to the picture, we have many more interactions, many more structural degrees of freedom. And basically, this has two possible complications. One is that our standard free energy approximations, like the harmonic oscillator, might not work very well when we have these very complicated structural degrees of freedom and weaker interactions in general. And another is that how do we even find which structures to look at with our model? A lot of times, the standard practice is just to place these things by hand and then do a local optimization. But that doesn't scale very well. So we'd like to think about better methods. And I'll just mention these global optimization methods first briefly, and then I'll spend the rest of the talk on the free energy methods. So the problem here is, how do we generalize finding relevant structures to do DFT calculations for? And the most physically relevant structures have the lowest energies. So basically the problem is we want to minimize the energy from a density functional theory calculation over all of the possible structural degrees of freedom. And this becomes then a global optimization problem. So to address this, we used an algorithm called Minima Hopping, which basically runs cycles of molecular dynamics trajectories and then local optimizations, and adjusts a set of parameters to either accept the new local minimum or reject it, and also adjusts the temperature in an effort to basically find the global minimum or basically the lowest energy structure of this potential energy surface. So we use this method to generate physically relevant structures to study solvation and ion effects for CO2 reduction on a copper surface. And the main results from this are that the solvent structures are very adsorbate specific, and that they depend on properties of the adsorbate like hydrogen bonding and the dipole moment. And we also use this method to put error estimates on the common practice of just doing local optimizations of arbitrary structures rather than global optimization. For ion effects, we found that these effects were actually very important and much larger than just solvation effects. And some of this was previously known, but we generated data with this global optimization method that was much more physically relevant and systematic. And then we could fit these electrostatic models with much more confidence than with previous data. So next, I'd like to talk about free energy. And this is a difficult thing to introduce in 15 minutes. But basically, the free energy describes the equilibrium and the probability distributions of physical systems. So if we think about a set of interacting atoms, then at every instant, it's fully specified by a microstate. And this might be the positions and velocities for a quantum mechanics system. It might be the quantum numbers, but it's fully specified as a microstate. And the set of all possible microstates is called the phase space. So let's look at an example. If we talk about molecular nitrogen converting to atomic nitrogen on a surface, then we can define the molecular state as all of the configurations with a nitrogen-nitrogen distance less than a certain value. And we can talk about the 2-nitrogen state, or the atomic state, as all of the configurations that have a nitrogen-nitrogen distance more than a certain value. So states like this are just subsets of the phase space. And the probabilities of those subsets are given by functions of the free energy. So that's why free energy is so important. For example, we can look at the reaction equilibrium between any two states as just a free energy difference between those states. And we can even think about rates in terms of free energies. So there are theories that connect free energy differences between states like transition states, which separate stable states, and theories connect those activation energies to rates. And this is obviously very important for catalysis because we're interested in controlling the rates of reactions. So why is this difficult to calculate? Well, if we look at what the free energy is on a theoretical level, it's basically a Laplace transform, or a multiplication of the probability of a single microstate with a given energy and the number of microstates with that energy. And that's a very difficult thing to calculate because it involves searching over all possible configurations, which is very difficult to do in a high dimensional setting. So in general, this integral is not really practically computable. And that's why approximations like the harmonic approximation are very important. This approximation basically says that if the forces are always linear in the displacements for all the relevant degrees of freedom, then we can decompose the motion into normal modes. And then there are analytical solutions for the free energies. And that basically means we don't have to do this difficult integration. Now, this works very well for simple and very strongly coupled systems. And we even have anharmonic corrections which can be applied to this. The problem is that they rely on intuition and they don't generalize very well to sort of more complicated degrees of freedom. So what can we do in a more general case? Well, more generally, we can calculate relative free energies from atomic simulations. And the two relevant methods for this talk of doing this are the probability distribution, which is an inversion of the formula I gave before, just connecting the free energies to equilibrium probabilities, and thermodynamic integration, which is a generalization of the idea that the energy difference between two states, so it's like an integral of generalized force over a path between two states. But even with these methods of calculating the free energy, often when we do atomic simulations, they become stuck in free energy basins. And this is because there are energy barriers between stable states. So the transitions between those become quite rare. And that means that the results of the simulation depend on the initial conditions, and they converge very slowly. And if we think about this from a probability standpoint, this just means that the physical distribution of states depends on the free energy. And if we want to sample more efficiently, then we have to add a bias, basically, to that free energy. Now, an optimal bias would be basically the additive inverse of the free energy along any variable. But we don't know that because that's what we're trying to calculate in the first place. So that's the motivation for adaptive enhanced sampling methods. So these basically update the bias as they proceed, such that we don't need to know it beforehand, and they try to converge toward that optimal sampling. So if we look at this example, if we have a simulation that starts in state A, and this barrier is larger than sort of the temperature, then the simulation will be stuck in state A. But if we add small amounts of free energy to our simulation at sort of regular frequencies, then we slowly fill in this free energy minimum, and eventually we sort of do this to all the minima, and we have sort of a uniform effective free energy surface and then a uniform sampling. Another way of doing this is to bias the derivative of the free energies, and this is sort of the generalized forces. You would think that this would be similar to basically this other idea, but it turns out that this method has sort of smoother convergence properties. And one way of thinking about that is, instead of filling in these free energy wells, we're sort of just pushing the simulation over them because we're biasing the derivative instead of the free energy itself. And a state-of-the-art method then, which came out fairly recently, actually combines these two ideas and sort of takes the best of both worlds. And using neural networks to combine them, we generate a fairly efficient estimator of the free energy. And this method came out very recently. So we wanted to apply this method to a surface reaction. And we chose nitrogen on ruthenium as sort of a prototypical, highly activated, so the barrier is very high, surface reaction to study. And for the collective variables to bias along, we chose the nitrogen-nitrogen distance and the distance from the center of mass to the surface. And after an equilibration time, we saw basically spontaneous association and dissociation, which you would never see in an unbiased simulation. So that's pretty cool to see, and it's an indication that the method is working, basically. And indeed, we saw that this combined forced frequency method displayed much better convergence than even a very efficient adaptive biasing force implementation. And this is really practically important because these time steps are so expensive in the context of density functional theory that if we need much less of them, that really helps us in terms of calculating these free energies from a first principles standpoint. So this is pretty exciting. And from this, we calculated the full free energy surface as a function of these two collective variables. And that gave us the minimum free energy path between those states, and thus sort of the rate, the free energy barrier, and the full mechanism. And this is more general than a conventional transition state search based on just the potential energy surface, because this self-consistently finds the free energy path rather than using the potential energy and then adding free energy corrections on top of that. So it's sort of a more general method. And when we compare this to conventional harmonic transition state theory, we have pretty reasonable agreement, which we actually expected because this system is quite simple and the 2n state is bound so strongly that we just expected harmonic approximation to actually work very well in this case. And this is nice because it demonstrates that this method works quite well in a simple case. And it's one of the first applications of this kind of method to a surface reaction with density functional theory. So this gives us confidence going forward to more complex models in the future, where we can rely less on intuition and less on harmonic approximations and so on. So the people I mostly am working with, Liza has helped a lot recently in terms of finishing this project, and Emery was very helpful in terms of getting it started. And my CSGF practicum was with Juan de Pablo at Argonne. And that was immensely helpful in terms of getting expertise from this group, which really specializes in doing enhanced sampling. And my PhD advisor at Stanford is an expert in DFT calculations for surface reactions. So we really were able to start this collaboration for that reason. And I worked with Karen mostly on the electrochemical studies. And I'd like to thank everyone for your attention for this virtual talk, and of course my advisors and my many collaborators, without which this would not be possible. And thanks to everyone involved with CSGF, which has been a really positive experience during my PhD. And I look forward to the question and answer period.